with social emotional learning, SEL. And this is something that actually, there's becoming issues even in a lot of conservative states. And so we actually have somebody we thought would be really encouraging and helpful for you guys to hear some of what's going on, some of the battles, to navigate how to engage in some of this. So, and actually, I think probably Dr. Lindsay, many of you I think have already been talking to, maybe you already know Dr. Lindsay, but somebody who definitely can give guidance. There's a bio in your notebook. We've already had a longer day, so I don't want to take a lot of time. We won't walk into the bio, you can read it, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Lindsay.
Hey y'all, I'm a Tennessean. Yeah, there we go. I know we got a couple of you here. It's great to be here. You gotta bear with me a little bit. I flew in from London yesterday, so I'm a little blinky. I went to the UK and danced on Karl Marx's grave. That actually happened. In case you wonder where I am politically. So I'm really happy to be here, and I do want to talk to you about social emotional learning. So I want to preface my comments by pointing out, I want to tell you, do you guys know, a lot of times I get accused of being a bit of a conspiracy theorist. You know my favorite part of being a conspiracy theorist is not having myocarditis. Yeah, so I'm here to talk to you all about social emotional learning, which after this previous presentation and how many of you know about diversity statements, and like half of you have heard of diversity statements, I'm like, oh no. We're a little behind an 8 ball on this one. This is probably an issue that people have not been paying nearly enough attention to, and when they do, they get blinded by the pleasant sounding language far more than by CRT or any of the stuff within the trans issues or the gender or the queer theory or any of this kind of Marxist identity politics that's coming. Social emotional learning sounds genuinely pleasant. It advertises itself very openly as trying to teach children social and emotional skills that they need to thrive. And everybody thinks, well, we do want children who have, I don't know, relationship management, self-awareness, social awareness, and so on. And nobody pauses to ask, is that really the school's job? Is it the government's job to teach that? Nobody pauses to even ask that. The issue was introduced by saying, even in a lot of conservative states, no, in every state. Every single state. You are not red enough to not have social emotional learning eating your school apart. And the reason is largely down to the fact that this, like everything else we're learning about, is a purposed project that has been developing over decades while we were all asleep at the wheel. Social emotional learning actually began, or it emerged in 1994. The organization that pushes it, the main lobbying organization, which is called CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, emerged the next year in 1995. And what I want to tell you is however much you trust social emotional learning, and some of you have heard of it, some of you maybe have warm or even positive or maybe ambivalent or somewhat negative feelings about it, however much you trust it now, even if you hate it, as far as it can be hated, you trust it too much. It's one of the most insidious things that's ever been brought into our nation, and it is being streamed into our children with billions and billions of dollars from the federal government every year, which is why all 50 states have fallen straight into the trap. That really started in 2015, the money, with the passage of a law that the many congressmen I've talked to about this have never heard of, which is called the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. Some of you will remember Common Core. Common Core did many things that lots of people didn't like. Conservatives were very keen on how not good it was in a lot of ways, but one of the things that's overlooked very frequently with Common Core is how much paperwork teachers had to file. And that paperwork was very specific. Teachers started having to write not whether or not the students were actually succeeding, achieving the standards of Common Core, but what they were doing. They had to report on themselves what they were doing in order to implement those standards. And along comes the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015 as Common Core starts to fail. And it mandates the reporting not just as it's been going under Common Core, but also of at least one non-academic competency. So this gets passed in 2015. Now teachers in all this paperwork have to report on non-academic competencies and what they're doing in non-academic domains. And CASEL goes on a gigantic consultant mission to the country and says, well, we have a program. It's called social emotional learning. If you implement it, this is what you do. It's very easy then to meet this new requirement that the Every Student Succeeds Act requires. And if you want to get federal money in your school systems, in your states, you have to be compliant with ESSA. Now I want to give you a little history of social emotional learning. Now you kind of know politically how it got there in every state. I mean, every single state is taking a lot of money to implement this, and there are very, very shady things that are happening to enable that. But I want to give you a little history just so you can understand a little bit of how little you should trust social emotional learning. Social emotional learning comes from the combination of basically two streams of thought. One was developed in 1968, great year for things happening in the United States, in Hartford, Connecticut, no, New Haven, Connecticut, sorry. In New Haven, Connecticut, by a man named James Comer, who wanted to shift into something that he called whole child education. He was looking at failing black schools there in New Haven, and he created a program called whole child education that was, we can't just attend to their academic needs if their home life is a disaster. If they don't have the kind of neighborhood, the kind of home, the kind of parents, or whatever else, the nutritional needs, we can't possibly expect these students to succeed. So he comes up with this program to do kind of what we would consider at-risk interventions with basically the whole school. It's kind of the stand and deliver model of schooling. And it turns out it was quite successful. In 5 years, he went from having something like 5% of the schools that he was overseeing going to college to something like 90%. Very successful. Very unique circumstances, very unique time, very unique implementation. And we know that because in the intervening, say, 30 years up until the 1990s, it was hit or miss if it could be replicated. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, nobody knew why. But the goal was to intervene and teach social and emotional skills largely through what's called a personal responsibility model to the kids. Own your feelings. If you're mad at somebody else in the class, you're mad at your situation, you got to learn to take responsibility for it. If you are having rough social engagement or whatever, you need to take responsibility and learn how to manage that. And it was basically something like a combination of psychology and social work being implemented for at-risk kids and at-risk schools, and had a big measure of success sometimes, and didn't work at all other times, and nobody quite knew why. This actually got adopted by a group of educators in the 1990s at a place, and this is where the history of social emotional learning gets weird. That's a program, that's a social program. We're all familiar with 60 social programs and then how they advance. That got implemented into social emotional learning at a place called the Fetzer Institute. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Fetzer Institute. The Fetzer Institute is in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was founded by a man named John Fetzer, who was a big radio guy, very rich man, rich enough to where he ended up buying the Detroit Tigers and owned them for a number of years. Turns out John Fetzer was a New Age spiritualist, which is to say an occultist. And he created the Fetzer Institute to forward his occult views, his New Age religion. He adopted these views, he based these views off of the work of an occultist in the United States by the name of Alice Bailey. Alice Bailey was primarily operative. She died in 1949. She primarily wrote in the 1920s. She wrote something like 30 occult books. She created her own publishing company to publish those books because people didn't want to publish occult books. And she called it in 1922 the Lucifer Publishing Company. She renamed the publishing company the Lucius Publishing Company in 1924, and it got reorganized as a trust a few years later. And John Fetzer's library was based off of Alice Bailey's books, including her book, Education in the New Age, which suggested that education in the future will be more psychology than education. And it will teach the then worked out right science of human relations. And now you're like, what in the heck is this? Turns out that's where Common Core came from too. Robert Mueller, who at the United Nations developed the Common Core program under the name of the World Core program, was a huge devotee of Alice Bailey as well. So these two things go hand in glove. Whatever those weird roots are, however, it's undeniable that what social emotional learning does is it uses psychological and social work interventions through teachers, bringing them to children in order to teach them the right answers to social and emotional questions that they're primed with in the classroom. So the classroom is a priming ground. Critical educators call it a generative approach to education. You present them with some material, it generates a conversation. Say you throw a drag queen in the classroom, and now you have a classroom discussion about sexuality, whether boys should dress like girls, whether girls always have to dress like girls, or if they can dress like boys too. And you're having a sexuality conversation based off of this. This is what the Drag Queen Story Hour program advertises itself as explicitly, as a generative pedagogical approach. And the goal is to generate that conversation and then use social emotional learning, which will be given through what they call an equity lens, to answer the questions that come up. And it can be very egregious, like the drag queens. This is why the Drag Queen Story Hour is being mainlined into our schools. I know it was mentioned earlier. This is why it's being mainlined. This can also be very subtle, to give you an idea of how subtle social emotional learning can become a manipulative exercise in raising what they call political literacy, or raising critical consciousness, which is code for Marxist thinking. Here's an example from a real educator named Jennifer McWilliams that I talked to fairly recently. I did an event with her in, Williamson County, Tennessee. And we did an event together. And when she was still an educator, went through a social emotional learning training platform, and this was one example given for second grade mathematics instruction. So bear with me, we're going to do a word problem. I used to be a math teacher, I know we get 10s. But it's second grade, so I did this, I told a crowd about this on the USS Yorktown in Charleston a few weeks ago, and there was actually a second grader in the crowd, and he got the question right. So this is your moment to find out if you're smarter than a second grader. So here's the word problem that you might encounter in second grade mathematics, and I want to show you what social emotional learning does with it. And this is, again, like I said, from a true social emotional learning training module for educators. The example is Johnny is riding in the car with his mom and dad on the way to an amusement park. The amusement park is 50 miles away. They've driven 30 miles so far. How much further is there to go? And now everybody's breathing easy. The word problem's easy. The answer is 12. Trust me, I'm a mathematician. I'm an expert. Here's what they're trained to do with that word problem. So they present it, I don't know if they put it up on a projector or whatever, I don't know what second graders do. But the word problem is presented and the teacher says, class, the goal for this, the teacher would say, the goal for this is to increase engagement and interest. The teacher says, class, before we answer the word problem, let's ask you first, raise your hand if you've ever been to an amusement park. And some kids raise their hand, second grade, 7-year-old. Some kids raise their hand, they've been to the amusement park, some kids don't. And so, some of you have, some of you haven't. The teacher might continue, or is instructed to continue. What are some reasons why people might not go to amusement parks? And eventually, and this is the objective, this is what they're trained to do, somebody will say, not everybody can afford it. And then once somebody says, not everybody can afford it, that generative theme that I was mentioning before from critical education was amusement park. Now it's raised a conversation about poverty. And what could we do about it? And of course, some kids eventually are going to say, make it free, make rich people pay for it. And now we're having a conversation about socialism in a second grade classroom. Somebody might bring up the fact that race correlates with poverty, and now we're having a CRT discussion, that the children race, so they have to do it. They might bring up the fact that, do all families have a mom and dad? What's your family look like, kids? Well, I only have a mom at home, and now we're having a discussion about feminism. My friend has 2 moms, now we're having a conversation about sexuality. Should we really ride in a car to go have fun? Isn't that bad for the environment? And now we're having a conversation about environmentalism. Some of your parents let you go to amusement parks, and some of the other kids' parents don't let them go. Now we're having a conversation about parental authority. And off of that very benign question, a whole social emotional architecture can be brought into a mathematics class at the second grade level to make sure that the necessary political conversations on these very left-wing topics are framed. And what happens in every case is that the right answer to the issue that's being raised is what generates equity. So let's talk about equity. I want to define a word for you, and I want you to try to guess what word I'm defining. This is a definition that actually comes out of the public administration literature. This is pretty close to word for word. An administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. Sounds like communism. That's one answer. Anybody got some more? Socialism. That's actually the definition in the public administration literature from George Frederickson for social equity. Equity is socialism. The real reason to go, I went to the UK, was not to dance on Marx's grave, as it turns out. I really went because I was invited to debate at the Oxford Union about this issue 2 nights ago. And I pointed out in the debate that, as a matter of fact, what I said in the debate was, in fact, that, this is a little bit of a story. I got invited to debate woke at Oxford, and the brain geniuses at the most elite university in the world stuck me on the wrong side of the debate. They thought I was woke. So I did a little satire, and I argued that Karl Marx was a conservative because he was blinded by his privilege to forms of social and cultural capital that he benefited from as a white European man. But that's exactly what social justice and equity are in relationship to communism and socialism. It's the expansion of the exact same idea to include forms of social capital and cultural capital. Okay? So that's all it is. That's what equity is all about. And the equity frame is what social emotional learning is designed to give as right answers to every single one of these questions. Now you think, no. I'm from Oklahoma. I know all about the program we have in Oklahoma. It's Christian-based. It's based on personal responsibility. That's not going to last even if it's the case. That will not last even if it's the case. The fact of the matter is that social emotional learning is being implemented through an elaborate bait and switch. If you read about social emotional learning, they'll tell you it's evidence-based, but they'll tell you that the evidence comes primarily from a meta-study that's a little questionable from 2011. Can talk all day, some of us already have, about manufactured academic evidence. Turns out that the personal responsibility model for social emotional learning isn't really what's implemented anymore. They instead implement something called transformative social emotional learning. CASEL only implements transformative social emotional learning, and they don't implement it by dealing with at-risk kids individually, where they identify a child who has a bad situation, and they bring them into a separate space and give them a professional counselor who's trained to deal with that in a therapeutic environment. They mainstream it into math class, like I just said, and the teacher becomes a psychologist. The teacher becomes a sociologist, and it's implemented in what they call a systemic way. Systemic, transformative social emotional learning is what they implement after convincing you to buy in that we're going to teach kids to manage their emotions and take personal responsibility for them, which is not at all what they're doing anymore. And there's no evidence to support that what they're implementing works whatsoever. Can't be. It's too new. That was only implemented, transformative social emotional learning only came out in 2019. But the evidence that they used to sell it was published in 2011. I mean, do the math. This is one of the second grade math problems all over again. There's a bait and switch. They're selling something very different. And what is the goal of transformative social emotional learning? Well, transformative should tell you, first of all, right away, that what it means is it's meant to transform. And if you've read your Marxism, or you've read the Sustainability Development Goals from the United Nations, which are 17 goals to transform our world, that it means Marxism. They say explicitly that what transformative social emotional learning is designed to do and be is to raise critical consciousness in students. That means to see things from the Marxist perspective. That is its explicit goal. And that's what they're implementing while saying it's something else. Deliberate misdirection, deliberate lying, deliberate bait and switch. Why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? This is where it gets dark. This is supposed to be the dark truth of social emotional learning. They tell you that social emotional learning is data driven. If you read the literature about it, it says that again and again. Social emotional learning is data driven. But then they also tell you that the reason that social emotional learning isn't to its fully fledged status yet is because they don't have enough data to get it there. So what does it mean by data driven? It means it's interested in data. And I'm going to just be blunt with you. I'm not going to waste your time. Social emotional learning is at scale a data mining operation on our children.
That's right.
It is almost nothing else. Its goal is to mine their data about their social states, their emotional states, how they react to stress, how they react to their academic stresses, their social stresses, how they get along with people in order to build them a social credit score and to predict where they can be plugged into a future economy that's being built by the ESG folks, which I know you spent the day bashing appropriately yesterday. SEL is, in their own words, explicitly used to induce children into understanding that it is their job to meet ESG standards and to implement the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. There is an article that was published in 2019 by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization, called SEL for SDGs. SEL for SDGs. Social Emotional Learning for the Sustainable Development Goals. What that article says is that replacing children's education, or teaching kids that their job is to satisfy the self-contradictory Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations Agenda 2030 causes a form of intellectual stress or mental stress called cognitive dissonance. And that's where you have that uncomfortable feeling where something that you think is true, you find out it's not true, or where you have a conflict between two contradictory things and you don't know what to do. It causes emotional distress, mental distress, lack of focus, but also sometimes physical distress. You've ever had two contradictory things you've run into, you don't know what to think about something to the point where you get physically sick. And what it says is it gives this whole description of how cognitive dissonance is and how it can impact education in a negative way. And then they say that social emotional learning is the ideal tool to implement in our schools because it helps children become more resilient and able to overcome the cognitive dissonance as they're being induced into being change agents to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for the United Nations. There's another name for what social emotional learning is then. Brainwashing. You've all got to stop calling it indoctrination. It's not indoctrination. Indoctrination is kid stuff. It is brainwashing, what the Chinese called xinao. Brainwash, that's what that means. It actually means wash brain. If your Mandarin is not up to scratch, better practice. It means wash brain. Its translation into English is usually given as thought reform. It is the method of reforming thought so that you have the right opinions. And for China, it was that you came out on the people's standpoint, or with the people's standpoint. In critical pedagogy, or critical education theory, following Paulo Freire in his very famous book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is at the heart of every college of education in North America. It is to die and reborn and be resurrected in your own personal Easter on the side of the oppressed, recognizing the need for permanent struggle. Social emotional learning, if you read, say, Robert J. Lifton's very, very detailed book called Thought Reform on the Psychology of Totalism, a study of brainwashing in China, which he wrote in the 1960s, where he interviewed people straight off the boat after they got exiled, after being released from Chinese brainwashing prisons. You read that, if you're familiar with what social emotional learning does, especially in the transformative sense, you recognize exactly what's happening. Children are put into a situation, we've already heard this a few times today, put into a situation where they're brought to, or where certain stressors are brought to bear, and then they're given a very limited set of options for how to resolve those stresses. But luckily, social emotional learning teaches them how to overcome the cognitive dissonance that this situation generates for them. I go around the country speaking to groups, especially for Moms for Liberty, and I tell them again and again, if you knew you were sending your children to a Maoist thought reform prison for 30 hours a week, what would you do differently? Because the fact is, you are. And they're using the equity frame instead of the people's standpoint, which was Renmin Li Chang in Chinese, as the thing that's the target. This is what social emotional learning is really about. But there's even criticisms of it from the left that reveal that the heart of this dark program is even worse than I've already made it out to sound. There's an analysis by a literal left-wing critical theorist named Ben Williamson in 2019 about social emotional learning because, like a good old school leftist, he's very concerned about big power, in particular big corporate power, but also big government power. See, leftists really, really, really like government power, but they really, 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 really hate government power they don't control. In fact, I don't think they hate anything more than government power they don't control. And so what Ben Williamson writes, first of all, he calls the paper psychodata. And he says that the social emotional learning programs that are being implemented throughout the world, this is by 2019, are already at that point very concerning entities. They use things such as not just surveying and directly data mining, but also high-tech devices like the Chromebooks that they're giving to all the kids in school that they can't go anywhere without. And that the cameras track their eyes to find out what they're interested in, what their attention span looks like, what else they're doing. It tracks everything else they do on their device. If they answer a math question, get bored and go text on people, it knows. Sometimes they are higher tech and they can actually read biometrics like skin conductance. Sometimes they read heart rate. There's an entire company called Heart Math, in which your math lessons are delivered to you while wearing heart rate monitors so you can find out what the stress response to kids is. This is an ocean of data that they're gathering that while the advertised purpose might be there, well, we can see where the kids are stressed out, and then we can intervene. We can make sure nobody falls behind, no child gets ahead, or whatever George Bush called it. But it can also be used for other purposes. You find out what stresses the kids out. You have them do surveys, and you have them play games that are in fact disguised Big Five and more granular than that, psychometric quizzes, so that they're actually taking psychology batteries throughout the year. Ben Williamson points out, they're making very elaborate psychological profiles that are even more granular than the so-called Big Five, the Ocean model. What is it? Openness, neuroticism, something. The Big Five's personality traits. But Ben Williamson isn't the only one who says that. Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum brags that that's one of the things that they're able to do using social emotional learning, is to create these highly granular personality trait profiles of every child, to find out what stresses them out, what makes them work, what makes them think, how they get along with people, what their family income looks like outside of those measurements. What social circumstances work for them, which ones don't, what kind of viewpoints do they have, what do they react to. They're implementing to enhance social emotional learning on their little devices, things like digital friends. Have you heard of digital friends? I've actually seen some of these. It's really weird. So what a digital friend is it's an AI. And you chat with it like it's your friend that you're texting to, but it's an AI. So you say things to it, and it says things back. I'm really stressed out about my schoolwork, and it says something maybe that's soothing back or whatever. Have y'all ever seen Harry Potter? Where that second movie where Ginny Weasley's writing in that diary and telling all of her secrets, and it's actually stealing her soul because it's Lord Voldemort? It's that. It's that. It is a massive data mining operation. I need you to understand how bad the data mining situation is, not just within social emotional learning, but within everything. I'll give you an example. We'll come back to Mr. Williamson when he says this psycho data is going to be used for, or what he fears that it's being used for, and who he names as implementing it and standing behind it, so you understand how big this issue is. John Deere is not an education company. They make tractors. They don't sell you tractors anymore. They lease you tractors because you can't own the software that runs the cool stuff in your tractor. What kind of cool stuff am I talking about? Well, I mean, there's how the engine works and all of that, and that, everything's like push button start, and the government can turn off your tractor if you do a protest or whatever else. But it also has all these cool sensors at the bottom of them. They can figure out stuff about soil density, water, certain nutrients or minerals in the soil content, and make a centimeter by centimeter grid of your entire farm. And you can go log on to your John Deere account, and you can see this grid of your farm, and of course you know where to water, you know where to add the magnesium or whatever it is you have to dump on your crops, you know where there's this problem and that problem, you know where you gotta go aerate the soil. Really useful for farmers. But the farmer who generates that data by driving the tractor he doesn't own, that he paid $500,000 to not own, the farmer that generates that data doesn't own any of that data. John Deere owns that data. And you know what John Deere does with it? John Deere sells that data to futures traders who bet against the farmer. And John Deere makes money hand over fist, and the farmer that they're exploiting loses. And this is why we have a left-wing Marxist aligned thinker looking at this situation when it comes to your children's minds and saying, wait a minute, maybe mining children, seeing children as a mine of information that can be used to socially control them through advertisements, through political propaganda, through the algorithms on their social media, through establishing a social credit system. And maybe that can turn them into perfectly predictable and nudgeable consumers is not a good idea. Maybe he's saying that's not a good idea. And he says, well, let's look at who wants to do this. I already mentioned Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab, by the way, tangentially, in his book, this year, from the 2022, wrote a book called The Great Narrative for a Better Future. The Great Reset, book 2. Again, the best part about being a conspiracy theorist is that you don't have myocarditis. But you also don't think stupid things like that something that has multiple books and an official starting date like the Great Reset isn't happening. And he says we're going to use ESG, or the public-private partnership, to create pressure from the top down, but where that doesn't work, we're going to use educational tools to make sure that the young people demand a different world. Why do you see a plus 29, plus 30 split in that 18 to 29 age group we heard from Mr. Graves this morning? And young people who are turning out record numbers. Because social emotional learning teaches them that racism and environmental causes and so on are existential threats that if a Republican gets in office, they're all going to die in 2 years. That's why. They are literally afraid for their life based on crazy stuff that's taught to them through social emotional learning that's heavily pushed by people like Klaus Schwab, who writes books that say, if we can't force it from the top down using a public-private partnership, by the way, that's a cute word for fascism, if we can't force it from the top down using ESG from a public-private partnership, we'll make the young people demand it. Companies won't have employees or customers because the young people won't participate. They'll vote the way we want. They're going to radically change the world and rewrite the social contract. Hello, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hello, French Revolution 2022 edition. That's what Klaus Schwab says is the point of the education systems of the current era. To do what the top-down pressure can't by generating a bottom-up demand. Get the supply and get the demand at the same time. So the World Economic Forum is very interested. They've been publishing white papers since 2015, incidentally the same year that ESSA passed. They've been publishing white papers since 2015 about how it's the education of the future, how it needs to be more technological, how there's experimental projects. For example, they brag about this in 2016 in a white paper they published on the issue. There are experimental projects, for example, in France, where they were sending social workers to work with pregnant women so that they would be able to teach the pregnant women to be doing social emotional learning on their children from birth. Prenatal SEL. We're worried about pre-K. They want it from before birth. They want to make sure the brainwashing program is complete and is grabbed as early as possible. So World Economic Forum's involved. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Social, Cultural Organization, is involved. The OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cultural Development, I think is what that stands for. Big money institutions like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, PS, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was a world server under Alice Bailey's Lucis Trust. Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, the Templeton Foundation, which is a maybe uncomfortable one to mention here, the Fetzer Institute. These are all major funders behind this. And so what Williamson and I conclude, and notice there's a huge political difference between the two of us. What we would conclude, not that we've worked together, but what we would conclude is the same. When he says that this is a program to gather the data necessary to institute a psychocracy, a government through psychological manipulation, to create perfectly predictable consumers, perfectly nudgeable economic situations, and perfectly controllable populations, I say that's what it is. When I look at what Klaus Schwab writes with his goals with the Great Reset, I realize that he looks back at history. I don't know if you know that Mr. Schwab has a bust of Lenin in his office. It's an uncomfortable fact. But he looks back and he sees people like Lenin, whom I'm assuming he likes, but I don't know for certain, understood that if you can do the top down, maybe you can use what Marx called the inversion of praxis to transform the world underneath. And he looks back at Mao, and I don't know what he thought of Mao. I know he was a big fan of Deng Xiaoping, who followed Mao, because he invited him to the World Economic Forum as early as he could. When he looks back at Mao, he understands that with the goal of building up a youth army, that if you can get the bottom up through the application of praxis, as Marx had it, then you can transform the future. And Klaus Schwab watched both of these not get where they needed to go and says, what if we did both at the same time? What if we implemented a gigantic data gathering and simultaneous brainwashing process that's building the plane as you fly it, so that you build the economy of the future from the public-private partnership top down, your ESG manipulations, that cartel, and meanwhile, you program the people who are going to get plugged into it from the bottom. And you make the population and the economy of the future at the same time. What then? That's what social emotional learning is. That's what it's for. I don't know how significant it is that it literally came out of an occult organization. That may or may not be significant, but it's weird. It's real weird. That's what it's all about. So what in the world can you do about it? Well, the first thing you need to do about social emotional learning is you need to understand that it exists, that it advertises itself and markets itself extremely well, and that it is not what it looks like. It is way, I don't know what kind of predator is wearing the sheep's clothing, but it's way worse than a wolf. It is way worse than a wolf. That's what, you have to understand what this thing is. How do you do that? I don't know, read the books. That's what I did. Look up social emotional learning in World Economic Forum, see what they've written about it. Look up social emotional learning in UNESCO, see what they say about it. What you're going to see is left wing, left wing, left wing, left wing, transform the world, great reset nonsense, page after page after page of it. Read the Handbook of Social Emotional Learning, Research and Practice. It's a thrilling 680-page read. And the foreword begins by a woman named Linda Darling Hammond, who is at the top of this CASEL pile. She's not at the head of CASEL, but she's very high up in CASEL. She was on the Obama Transition Team for Education and the Biden Transition Team for Education. She is one of the chief lobbyists for this, and she writes the foreword to that handbook, which was published in 2016. She says the point of SEL, that a socially emotionally compliant school, this is 7 years ago. This is before transformative. By the way, transformative is getting supplanted now with something called culturally affirming social emotional learning. The Biden administration Department of Education has already bought into this, heavily funded by friends at the Arabella Group and the Open Society Foundation. And they say that the transformative thing in CASEL is conservative, and it's a nice first step at best, but it's really actually just reproducing it. It's white supremacy with a hug. This is what they call the current Marxist program. But anyway, Darling Hammond is instrumental in having brought this thing to the fore, and she writes in this foreword to this book, which is the Handbook of Social Emotional Learning, that it means to be Freire, to be a social emotional school. And that means, it refers to Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian Marxist educator who ruined South America, and who came up with that generative approach that I described with the word problem earlier, or the drag queens. Turns out the drag queens themselves wrote a paper, published in one of the most outstanding academic journals, Curriculum Inquiry, explaining, it's called Drag Pedagogy, it's open access, you can look it up and read it yourself. The last sentence is, we'll leave a trail of glitter in the carpet that will never come out, but the carpet's your children. They explain in the paper that they advertise that it's LGBT empathy, that they use as a marketing strategy, but the point is to induce children to live queerly. That it is to lead them into alternate modes of kinship, they say. They say the family, they say this is their words. The Drag Queen Story Hour is family friendly in the wink-wink sense of family as a queer code for the queer family you make on the street. And I got kicked off of Twitter for calling these people groomers. This generative method of Paulo Freire, Linda Darling Hammond said, is what at its core makes social emotional learning exist in a school. She says that it's about Paulo Freire's vision for humanization and transformation, which are two Marxist code words. I don't know if you know that Marx called his entire program humanism, because you do your work, do the work, to humanize the world, humanize nature, humanize people, humanize yourself by becoming a Marxist. And Linda Darling Hammond herself, in the foreword of that book, tells you this is what it means to do social emotional learning. If you understand the language and you bother to read Marx, then you understand it means to be Marxist. It is Marxist programming. What can you do more practically? Well, it's a data mining operation. The whole thing works by data mining. The whole thing depends on data mining. What does that suggest? Do things to prevent data mining children in your state. Your children are not oil wells for the future regime to pull out the necessary resource straight out of their heads like it's the ground so that they can build a monetary system based on it that awards them according to their social credit score. If you ban the data mining of children and data mining more generally, if you treat it like copyright law, that the generator of that data, the driver of the tractor, the kid doing his math homework, is the author of that data and therefore holds something like a copyright to it, you're going to have but a huge monkey wrench in their spokes. They're going to flip right over the bike and they're going to say, damn you white supremacists, or whatever they're going to blame. Damn you racists that don't want whatever. The data mining is going to be very difficult to stop. I'll just be blunt with you, because the number one buyer of that data currently, if you wondered if this is a system in which people are going to look for political control, the number one buyer of that data at present is the United States intelligence community. So that's going to be a challenge. Another thing you're going to have to do is get off the government tit. If you're taking federal money in your state for education, you are on the hook. You have nowhere to go. You have absolutely nowhere to go. I very much agree with the kind of super conservative, or maybe it's just mainline conservative view, that we shouldn't have a Department of Education at all, but we do. I agree, believe it or not, with Betsy DeVos that if it does exist, that what it should do is it should issue block grants based on something like population or something very neutral, rather than, for example, right now, you have ESSER funding that comes down, and that's connected to how many at-risk students you have. So what did these genius leftists do? What do genius leftists do, by the way? What is their job? It's to change the definition of words till they get their way, right? So what do? They redefine what it means to be college and career ready to mean that you're social emotional learning compliant, that you meet the competencies of social awareness and self-awareness and whatever other malarkey they have, to use a Bidenism. To quote him well. This is like his best line. Sometimes the only one I understood, actually. So what they did was they redefined college and career ready, and then they redefined at-risk. What do you picture in your mind when you hear about an at-risk student? Rough home life, somebody, bad situation in the neighborhood, something's bad, psychological issues. You think real trauma, real issues, real problems, real poverty, real, whatever it is. They redefined at-risk to be at risk of not graduating college and career ready. 42 states have done that. So every student is at risk, and so every student qualifies to receive money from the federal government for the purpose of revamping the schools to implement more social emotional learning. We're talking billions upon billions of dollars at this point. I would think very, very long and hard about accepting, say, gigantic educational grants from a company like Google. Looking at you, Virginia. Looking at you, Oklahoma. What was it, 300 million in Virginia, 75 million in Oklahoma? I mean, I know Virginia is a little bit purple, but Oklahoma's not. Do you think Google, with those devices, is interested in educating students in Oklahoma values? Or do you think that they're interested in doing things that benefit Google, like gathering data off of them and selling it to the federal government, so that they can build an instrument of control, or selling it to advertisers so that their algorithms are more accurately reflective of what it is that they might want to buy? If I might be a little bit colorful, let me give you how granular and sensitive this data can be that they're gathering. I cannot urge you strongly enough. You must take the data issues seriously in your state. I have a friend, this is a little personal. She and I are pretty good friends. It's not like that. I don't have any of this crazy stuff going on. But we talk rather freely, and so she texted me at the beginning of the year laughing about one of those, exercise, step, heart rate, whatever apps, the watch she wears, and it tracks all of her stuff. And she's laughing, and she says, do you know what it says my number 2 reason for losing sleep in 2021 was? Masturbating. And I was like, did you tell it? Did you tell your watch that you're diddling yourself? And she's like, no, it figured it out. It figured it out. That's what these machine learning algorithms that they're using to monitor your children are able to figure out. So they are certainly able to take that data, figure out certain behaviors such as that or other things, decide emotional states, and make associations between what kind of buying habits people have, what kind of political behavior they engage in. And if they can do it with that, they can do it with so-and-so's algorithm just got tweaked this way, and now let's see how their buying behavior, political behavior changes. If we feed them a bunch of radicalizing fake news or disinformation or real information or whatever, selectively tailor their algorithm, how do they react? It's so imperative that we start thinking much more clearly about this data collection, and data aggregation, and data selling. Even the school choice issue is fraught with this. The law of the land right now is that which the government can't get through the front door, corporations are doing through the back door. That's called public-private partnership, which probably sounds better in the original German. So if you go into school choice legislation blindly and just create something like the Arizona voucher system, which on its surface looks very good, you have to think, is there going to be a corporation that comes in like John Deere and creates a data mining operation of our kids and creates something by selling the data that undercuts the cost of every other school or schooling approach in the entire state, and therefore creates a giant data mining operation out of our children? I'm not saying that that's necessarily what's going to happen, but I'm saying that we should be thinking through this before we jump off the deep end.
They already are.
Good. This is very, very important. The data mining is the central thing that you must stop with social emotional learning. That said, another thing you can do, and it's very important to think about this, North Carolina already went the other way on this, proactively in their legislation. Teachers are not psychologists. Teachers are not social workers. Classrooms are not controlled therapeutic spaces. Nobody should be practicing psychology or social work with children without a license to do so outside of therapeutic spaces. Social emotional programs should be opt-in by parents, if they're in the schools at all, not something that you can barely kind of halfway opt out of, and certainly not something that's systemically integrated into every subject. I don't know how you deal with this legislatively. This is how the left works, is they force you to legislate on things like drag queens, where there's no clean answer. You get the wording wrong, somebody dresses up as Cinderella for Halloween, and that's a gendered performance, and the left's going to get your law thrown out in court. They're very good at this. They make you legislate on things you shouldn't have to legislate on. And then they force you and hold you to it. You have to be so careful with this. But it's absolutely imperative that you protect children from psychological manipulation that's not appropriate. And this certainly must be back to basics style curriculum. The instruction of mathematics, for example, cannot be hijacked into a social emotional learning lesson. Social emotional learning, if anything, needs to be separate from mainline academic instruction. The competencies that your states are interested in cannot be non-academic. That's not the school's job. It violates parental rights. And if you don't get those things right, those lawsuits are going to come eventually, or we're just going to lose our nation. Because like I said, the reason, all the things that we heard about from John Graves this morning about the election, the reason that you had a 30-point split for the first time in history with the largest turnout ever of that generation of voters, 18 to 29, is because they were raised in a social emotional learning environment that has taught them to see these things as existential conditions that they must act upon and that they must only understand from leftist perspectives. Ultimately, not only are you going to have to deal with social emotional learning, you're going to have to deal with the accreditation systems in your colleges of education. Schools can't be reliant upon, we heard about the American Academy of Pediatrics, we heard about the American Library Association. Every one of these professional associations we've been relying on is corrupt. The ones that are the big ones are all corrupt. You have to start looking deeper, getting under the surface. I know your jobs are very difficult, I know they're very time consuming. This is BS, but you have to do it because the things that we rely upon, that we outsource to experts, have been captured by monopolization. Even with the idea of bringing in more counselors and social workers into the schools, pause for a minute to realize how skewed those departments are in academia. Some of them are 127 to 1, left to right, social work in particular. These are the kinds of things that we have to be facing. This is how they're subverting. If we stop ESG, the energy crisis, all the other things, the inflation that's all being thrown at us, which are probably #1 issues. 5 years from now, we're going through another Black Lives Matter riot throughout the whole summer or whatever, because our kids are being programmed to think that way about every single issue. And in the meantime, they're stealing their academic time away from them so that they don't learn math, they don't learn to read, they don't learn to write, they don't learn history, they don't learn science. Competencies across the board are running at what, like 30%, 40% in those core subjects. Back to basics is absolutely necessary. Getting the psychology and sociology out, absolutely necessary. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell you about this.